Thanks for coming into Sports On, everybody. Joined by six-time Grand Slam champion Rennae Stubbs. And Rennae, inexplicably, I think to me, Novak Djokovic reportedly complaining about the quarantine restrictions set in place ahead of the first slam of the year, the Australian Open, reportedly making a list of close to 20 demands. What's your reaction to what he's done?
Well, look, I think that he was honestly trying to do his best as a world number one, as such a prolific champion here in Australia. I think he was really trying his best to sort of see if he could use his weight of who he was to try and get some things for the players, whether it be, suggestions on private homes with tennis courts, and there's quite a few here in Melbourne, to allow the players to actually still practice and go about practice routine, their training routines, etc. But the bottom line is, Carolyn, is that the Victorian government is literally probably the most locked down state we've had almost in the world as far as keeping coronavirus, away. So they weren't taking any chances. They didn't want any players to be leaving their rooms now. They didn't want to have any sort of public spread of the disease. So they're trying to contain it. So they just said absolutely no to every single request that he made.
To me, and this is just me speaking, Rennae, it sounds a little bit tone deaf given the current state of the global pandemic outside of the measures that Australia has taken, particularly with the tournament that he organized back in June, in which a number of players contracted this virus. You saw Nick Kyrgios go on Twitter and call him out, essentially. He called him a tool. I mean, I wouldn't go that far, but at the same time, what is some of the player reaction based around Novak, making this sort of request?
Well, I think you're going to have, a few, or you're going to have probably the majority of players that are stuck in the situation sort of rooting for him, hoping that he can get something accomplished for them. But most of the players would also understand that the Victorian government really makes the rules here. This has nothing to do with Tennis Australia. This really does have nothing to do with the tournament. This is more about the guidance of the government here in Australia. And when they say no is a hard no. It's not a ambiguous sort of gray area for them. This is like a yes or a no situation. And clearly things changed overnight, as a lot of players feel that the rules changed. But really what happened was that the strain of the COVID that has come from the UK now is very much scaring a lot of people here in Australia. And clearly, players on that Abu Dhabi flight in particular from the Middle East, those players were in Europe. So there's a chance that, there's a lot of contraction going on there as it was in the US. So the last place we want people coming from really is highly infected areas like the UK and, of course, United States, and a flight left from LA. So we all know that that's probably the worst place in the US right now. So I think the Victorian government just really got to a point where when the flights were coming in and there were positive tests on a lot of the flights that came in, they just decided, you know what, we gave it as way as we could. But now with positive tests coming off of those flights, we're having a hard lockdown on all of those people on that plane. It's unfortunate.
That being said, Rennae, does it even make sense, honestly, to hold a Grand Slam with things the way that they are globally?
Look, we held the US Open during the middle of the pandemic in New York, which I thought was a miracle in itself. We held Roland Garros during the middle of the pandemic in France, which was in itself really not a great idea. But both of them came off. Both of them happened. We both had champions in both of those Grand Slams. And there was really only a couple of little incidences in both of those Grand Slams. So can we have it? Yes, we can have it. But again, very different rules here in Australia compared to Paris and compared to New York. There was the spread of the virus was in the city already. We were trying to keep the players safe in the bubble. Whereas in this occasion, Australians want the players to be the ones that are staying away from them. So we're trying to keep the bubble around an entire city and therefore an entire country that is surrounded by water. And so the players really need to think very differently about this Grand Slam comparative to the last two. And I think that's where they're struggling to realize that. But yeah, I think, look, once the quarantine is over, and it will be over in 14 days, they will be out, be able to practice and train and be amongst people of Victoria with no masks, and they'll feel like they're really living a normal life. So the chaos at the beginning is certainly going to affect them. It's not going to be easy for them to play in a Grand Slam, but they have a week to prepare before that Grand Slam, and I think they're going to try and take advantage of that 1 week.
You know more about this than most because you came over to Australia. You're there now from the United States. You went through that strict lockdown, that 14-day quarantine period, and we're keeping everybody up to date on your Instagram, which was hilarious and looked like it was mentally challenging. At the same time, because you've also been a player, having a week run up and being hamstrung, as some of the players feel, just in terms of not being able to train the way they want to, or stay in a more comfortable lodging, not have the food available to them that they feel like they would prefer. Is a week enough of a run up for elite athletes to get ready for a tournament of this caliber, or do they have a point?
Look, is it ideal? No, it's definitely not ideal, particularly for the men. They're playing best of five. We know how much more taxing that can be. You're on the court for 4 or 5 hours a day, possibly 4 or 5 hours in a match. Not difficult to recover if you haven't done the necessary training. Having said that, Carolyn, most of the players would have done a lot of their major sort of training blocks, as we call them, prior to coming out here to Australia. The last 1 or 2 weeks is really just playing sets, practicing with other players. It's not as intense as sort of the month before. In swimming, they call it sort of like tapering off, whereas in tennis, it's sort of similar in some respects. The problem that they're going to have is that they have to be very careful when they come back. There is a tournament leading up to the Australian Open. I don't see the ones in quarantine having – I don't think it's advisable for them to play in that event, because when you step onto the court and play a match, it is definitely a lot more physical. So you will see a lot of injuries come out of that. So they have to be very careful if they want to play that lead-up tournament. I would say the ones that are in lockdown are probably going to take that week to train. And I think they can get into it. And once you're into the Grand Slam, Carolyn, you win one match, you're sort of into it physically and mentally. And so I think they'll be okay. The first round won't be easy.
So just lastly, Rennae, before I let you go, he's pointing toward February 8th for the Grand Slam that's been pushed back already. I mean, what do you expect once things are underway? Are we going to see, like you mentioned, an uptick in injury, for example? Are we going to see more fatigue? Is there going to be any kind of measurable effect of how difficult the run-up to this has been, or do you expect that this will be successful at the Australian Open in the first slam of the year?
Well, if I could look into a crystal ball, I'm sure Craig Tiley, the tournament director and CEO of Tennis Australia, would like to know all the answers to that. And I don't think we'll know until after the tournament, until it's all said and done, and how players react to this situation, and physically, how do they come out of it? Will we see any injuries? They're going to be doing everything they can at this moment in these 2 weeks of lockdown in their rooms to train. We're seeing it all on their Instagram, social media. I mean, that's the beauty of social media, is that we get to see what they're doing. So we'll see which ones prepared as much as they could in their own room. And then, as I said, that week prior to the Australian Open, what they can do before the tournament starts. And then I guess the bottom line is we'll wait and see.
Just as a personal note, coming over to Australia from the United States, is it reassuring for you to be in an environment that's had such strict lockdown procedures, where life has a semblance of normality, as the rest of us back here stateside and other parts of the world are pining for that sort of normalcy?
Yeah, I can honestly say, when the players sort of started complaining a little bit about having to do it, I was like, look, you're going to get out and you're going to realize what real life is again. I think Australia and New Zealand, obviously being such liberal sort of open countries, the fact that they've been able to really stamp COVID out of this country is pretty remarkable. And I have to say, Carolyn, as somebody who lives in New York, as you know, but is Australian, coming home and going through that 2-week quarantine is not easy. It's not easy, but oh my goodness gracious me, is it worth it once you get out? Because we are living in a normal society here in Australia, and we get 1 or 2 cases in a city and the whole state goes into lockdown and no one's allowed to travel. So Australians have really taken it very seriously. And because of that, we're all living a very normal life. It's possible. So I would advise anybody out there to sort of try and take the model that's been done here in Australia and do it, because it does work.
We're jealous, Rennae. Thanks for being with us.
You're welcome, Carolyn. Hopefully it'll all be normal when we get back to New York together.